Welcome everybody. The webinar will start in a few minutes. Just a few technical instructions. The webinar will be recorded. Also, please ask your question in the chat. Our team will collect them and the speakers will respond during the final discussion. So just a few minutes of patience and enjoy the webinar. Thank you.
So good morning to everyone. My name is Luciano Saso. I'm the president of UNICA. A very warm welcome from me to this webinar on climate neutrality, a theoretical approach promoted by the University of Lausanne. UNICA is a network of 55 universities based in 38 capital cities in Europe. And the UNICA Green is a very important working group of UNICA. Started actually in 2010 after a very interesting request by students who asked us at that time to do more to make our university greener. And in the last 10 years, a lot of interesting activities have been organized. Recently, after the COVID crisis, we started to organize these webinars. And we think this can also be a good way to work together, to have shorter meetings like the one today, but to keep in touch and continue to work together for these important goals that we have in UNICA and beyond. And it is now a pleasure to thank the main actors, the main contributors to this event. First of all, Delphine Dussault, Sustainability Manager of the University of Lausanne. Our speaker today will be Augustin Fragnière, researcher at the Interdisciplinary Center for Sustainability at the University of Lausanne. And then I would like to thank also very much Laura Brossico and Laura Collò at the UNICA Secretariat for all the work to organize this webinar and the other ones which will follow. So please look at the website of UNICA, and there you will find all the relevant information for this series of webinars, but also the recordings of the previous events. So without further ado, I would like to leave the floor to Delphine Dussault for the introduction. Thank you for participating, and I wish you a very interesting and very pleasant meeting today.
Okay, thank you, Luciano. So my turn to welcome you all to this webinar. As Luciano said, UNICA Green is a working group of UNICA network that focus especially on integrating sustainability in university. So the group exists for 10 years now, and currently it gathers 11 UNICA university as well as 2 others university that we call partners, which do not belong to the UNICA network. Although at the beginning on the group, we were mainly focusing on environmental aspect of sustainability. In recent years, we have also been discussing issues related to the integration of sustainability in the research area and in the teaching. So we more and more broaden our discussions topics. So yeah, I would like, yeah. So now I would like to introduce our two-day speakers. So Augustin Fragnière work at the Interdisciplinary Center for Sustainability at the University of Lausanne. He has an academic training in philosophy and environmental sciences, and he has conducted researches on ethical and political dimension of global environmental problems in Switzerland, in France, and in United States. At the Interdisciplinary Center for Sustainability, Augustin was on several occasions working with municipalities, mainly, wanting to be carbon neutral. However, apart claiming this neutrality, municipalities did not have a clear idea on the definition of what was to be carbon neutral. So I think that it's very important when you begin when you begin this project to be aware of what does it mean for you, for your university to be carbon neutral. So I hope that the presentation of Augustin could give you elements of reflection that would help you to clarify your definition of carbon neutrality. And I just want to maybe recall you the questions rules. So do not hesitate to write your question during the presentation in the Zoom chat, and then we will treat them one after the others. So Augustin, I give you the floor.
Okay, thank you, Delphine. Good morning, everyone, and thank you to UNICA for its kind invitation. I'm glad to be here with you today to talk about carbon neutrality. So I'm going to share my screen quickly. Here we are. So as you can see, I've changed my title slightly for climate neutrality towards a science-based approach. And I think that this new title reflects the main argument of my talk. That is that there are a lot of, as Delphine just told us, a lot of misconceptions about the definition of climate neutrality, what it is, and what place it should take in a climate strategy for an institution, a company, or even wider territory like a city or even a region or a country. So we need a more science-based approach, I think, and there are several initiatives in the literature going in this direction. So I'll start with that. The mainstream conception of carbon neutrality has been this for years, especially in the private sector and for companies, but also more broadly. So the idea here is you calculate your emissions as a company, for example, or an institution like university, then you try to reduce them as much as you can. But that's the first problem with this, this conception of neutrality is that how much you can reduce, there's no clear target and guidelines about how much you should reduce. And it's mostly up to the company to choose what level of effort it wants to put in the reduction of carbon emissions. And then you equalize, you buy carbon credits to offset your remaining emissions. And the result is that you're supposedly carbon neutral. So I'll explain more into detail during my talk why I think this conception here, especially the fact that we can just buy an amount of offsets, of carbon offsets, that is carbon credits that are equal to the amount of emissions on a given year, and just to be carbon neutral. And I think this doesn't hold. I think it's not the right approach. So I'll explain it more into details, but mainly it is because it doesn't fit with the scientific definition of carbon neutrality, and it's not compatible with the goal to reach net zero emissions on a global scale by 2050, as the Paris Agreement on climate change demands. In the worst case, this kind of approach to neutrality can amount to mere greenwashing. You should know that carbon credits, for example, 1 ton of CO2, the carbon credits corresponding to 1 ton of CO2 on the market costs now on average $3. So it's very cheap to just buy out carbon offsets to compensate your emissions and pretend that you're carbon neutral. But I think the definition should be much more stringent than that and thorough. So let's start with the scientific definition of neutrality. There's only one, and we find it in the IPCC reports, especially in the last special report on the 1.5 degree target. So net zero carbon dioxide emissions are achieved when anthropogenic CO2 emissions are balanced globally by anthropogenic CO2 removals over a specified period. And they continue, net zero emissions are also referred to as carbon neutrality. So in this definition, notice that carbon neutrality equals net zero emissions. Those two are synonymous. And that it's a global definition. So that's the definition for carbon neutrality on the global scale for the whole planet. So what does it mean in other terms? It means that from the current situation, that is an imbalance between all what we emit into the atmosphere, all the greenhouse gases we send into the atmosphere, and all let's talk about CO2 more than greenhouse gases. All the CO2 we take out of the atmosphere, which is 0 right now, there is an imbalance. So CO2 is accumulating into the atmosphere and reinforcing the greenhouse effect and causing climate change. So we should shift or transition from this situation to a situation where what we emit is balanced by what we remove, all the CO2 we remove from the atmosphere. And to do that, we need to do two things mainly. We have to reduce our emissions dramatically. So in this example, it's minus 85%, I think. But we should even do more than that. We'll see that a little later. And we have to ramp up negative emissions. So what are negative emissions? They are, the principle is sucking up CO2 out of the atmosphere and storing it somewhere, usually underground, permanently. So how we can do that? There are several means to do that, so-called natural solutions, like just planting trees, for example, or changing practices in agriculture or the way we use soil and land. But there are also technological means, like building big ventilators, filtering the air and taking out the CO2. So there are various possible technologies, but you should know that the global potential for all those solutions is limited. And there are a lot of unknown and a lot of uncertainties about whether we will be able to scale that at a sufficiently to address the problem of climate change, and so that it be relevant to fight climate change. So there are still uncertainties about those negative emissions or carbon dioxide removal. So that's the same. So one other important thing is that here we're talking about anthropogenic negative emissions or sinks. That's the same. The uptake of carbon dioxide by natural ecosystems like forests, currently existing forests or the ocean, they don't count in the definition of carbon neutrality according to the IPCC. It's only the negative emissions that we do ourselves as human actively that count. And that's an important dimension of the definition. So now, how does this translate into the climate strategy of a company, an institution like a university or a city or even a country? So there are mainly three elements, important elements here in a climate strategy. The first one is to calculate a carbon footprint. The second one is to devise an emission pathway and choose a target in terms of emission reductions. And the third one is to decide what will be the role of carbon credits and carbon finance in this strategy and how it can or cannot help reach a target, for example, climate neutrality or carbon neutrality. So by the way, usually when we say climate neutrality, this involves all types of greenhouse gases. And when we say carbon neutrality, it's only CO2 usually. But I will use the two terms in this presentation, probably, mostly carbon neutrality. So all those three steps or elements here beg different questions that are normative questions and that have a bearing on the quality of the climate strategy and in its thoroughness. So I will take them in turn. I will pass pretty quickly on the first two and take a little bit more time about the role of carbon offsetting credits, because they play a big role in this mainstream conception of carbon neutrality that I exposed at the beginning of my talk, and that I want to show you that it doesn't hold, or maybe that it's not the right approach. The carbon footprint first. So most of you probably already know that when you calculate the carbon footprint of your institution, we usually consider three scopes, so three different kinds of emissions. So scope 1 are direct emissions, that is emissions that are produced on site or directly by the operations of your institution. The scope 2 are indirect emissions, so that are outside the perimeter of your institution, but for the purpose of producing the energy that you consume as an institution, so usually electricity. So for example, if the electricity your university is consuming stems from a coal power plant, for example, you would have to take into account those emissions in scope 2. And scope 3 are all the other indirect emissions, for example, the emissions embedded in the goods and services that we import as a country or as an institution. So for example, if your university buys a lot of IT material like laptops, for example, building those laptops involved a lot of emissions in other countries. So all those emissions that were necessary to build your consumption goods, basically, and all the material you use, we have to take them into account in scope 3. So there are some discussions about which scopes we should take into account in a climate strategy, since scope 1 and 2 are much easier to calculate and measure. And we have much more leverage on the reduction in scope 1, of course, than in scope 3. But in fact, I will here argue that we should take all three scopes into account. And why? So if we look at a few figures, you see here that in Switzerland, for example, when we take the full climate footprint of Switzerland, Scope 3 amounts to 66%, so 2/3 of the emissions, of the total emissions. At UNIL, for example, it's coherent and consistent with a Swiss figure. It's around 60%, but that doesn't even encompass all the Scope 3 emissions, since we still lack some reliable figures for food, for example. For other countries, it's much less. Like Scope 3 is 11% of the total footprint, carbon footprint of Germany, 5% in the USA. So it varies quite a lot among countries, but most of the time we consider Scope 3 as part of our impact of climate change, and especially as in Western countries where we have usually a pretty high carbon footprint per person. It's part of our responsibility to also take this Scope 3 into account, at least partially, when you calculate that and when you devise your climate strategy. Then emission pathways. So for which target should we aim in terms of emission reductions? So this is just a reminder of the Paris Agreement goals. So holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So how does that translate in terms of CO2 emissions? So to know that, we have to turn to the IPCC again, and here we see different kind of emission pathways or trajectories that are compatible with the goal of 1.5, limiting the temperature, the warming to 1.5 degrees globally. So all these pathways involve emission reductions, but also negative emissions. So in brown, it's the so-called natural solutions, and then in yellow, it's mostly the more technological solutions. So all those pathways are consistent with 1.5 degree, but this one, P1, uses very little negative emissions, and this one, in which the humanity waits much longer to reduce its emissions, involves much more negative emission technologies, and we don't even know if it will be possible to do that. So for example, if we take this average scenario, the P2 here, it involves a decrease of emissions of around 7% each year globally for the planet. And to reach to reach the 1.5 degrees target, we would need to reduce the global emissions by 47% by 2030, so in 10 years. So that's a huge endeavor, and by 95% by 2050 to reach at that point net zero emissions here. That is carbon neutrality on global scale. For 2 degrees, it gives us a little bit more time, but not so much. So it's only -25 in 2030, and it's minus 95% in 2070. So you see that to reach net zero emissions on a global scale, anyway, we'll need to cut almost all carbon emissions, maybe only with a 5% remaining that can be balanced with negative emission technologies. So this has become broadly the main standard to assess the climate strategy also of countries, companies, regions, and so on. So I'd say that to be thorough and kind of science-based, the climate strategy should be at least aligned on these scenarios. So on these figures here, at least on the 2 degree target with that kind of reduction targets. So now, what's the role of carbon finance in such a strategy? So you have to know first, if you don't know it already, that there are 2 broad kinds of carbon credits. The first ones are generated by projects that avoid CO2 emissions. So each carbon credit sold in the market corresponds to 1 ton of CO2 that has not been emitted. And usually, how do we do that? Those projects, the main kind of project is renewable energies. So for example, if you have a coal power plant that emits a lot of CO2 and you replace it with, for example, windmills or solar panels, over 20 years, you avoid the emissions that the coal power plant would have emitted if you haven't had replaced it with renewable energies. So you can calculate the amount of emissions that you've avoided in implementing those renewable energies. And then you can sell that on the market as carbon credits. The other kind of carbon credits are negative emission credits. So when, for example, a company is a specialized company, a forestry company, for example, is planting trees, the trees will absorb CO2 that is already in the atmosphere when they're growing and store the carbon in the wood, basically. And for each ton of carbon that has been absorbed and stored, you can sell 1 credit. So their role in a climate strategy is slightly different, since, as you've seen in the previous slide, we will need a lot of negative emissions globally to reach net zero emissions or climate neutrality by 2050. So can the purchase of avoided emission credits achieve carbon neutrality at the scale of a company or a university, for example? Here, it's a clear no, if according to the evolving but current literature on science-based targets. So you remember that's a mainstream conception of carbon neutrality. You have some emissions and you just buy the same amount of carbon credits, and the result, you subtract them, the result is 0. And that doesn't work to reach carbon neutrality. It doesn't correspond to the scientific definition, as I said before, but there are also other problems. The first one is that there are doubts about the environmental integrity of carbon credits. We're not always sure. There are different quality of credits, of course, on the market, but we're not always sure that 1 credit really corresponds to 1 ton of CO2 that has not been emitted. I won't delve further into this problem because there's a lot of things to say, but I don't have time. But we can take that during the Q&A if you're interested. But also, this is based on a dubious accounting principle. It's purely arbitrary to say that it's to make an equivalence between reducing one's own emissions, even only direct emissions, but or all 3 scopes, but one's own emissions, and just buying credits. That is financing emission reductions elsewhere in the world. We decided, this mainstream conception decided that it's equivalent, but it's not. It's not, because if we want to reach carbon neutrality by 2050 on a global scale, everybody will have to reduce its emissions. So you cannot just escape that by buying credits elsewhere. And that's why it's also incompatible with the net zero target at global scale. Here it's also dubious, and a dubious accounting principle, because there is no physical basis to make this equivalence. I mean, we do as if financing emission reductions elsewhere is the same as reducing our own emissions, but it's not true. It's not exactly the same, because when we buy credits, our own emissions are not reduced, they stay the same. And at one extreme, we could imagine even a company whose emissions are going up, but who's buying enough credits to claim carbon neutrality, and that doesn't make sense. Also, it hides the most important information, that is the real ambition of the climate strategy. If a company, as I said, is not reducing its emissions but buying enough offset, it could just say, according to this mainstream conception, okay, I'm carbon neutral, but in reality, it doesn't communicate with about the real efforts it does to reduce its emissions. Can the purchase of negative emission credits achieve carbon neutrality now? So there's still some kind of controversy about that, but I'd say maybe, but only under stringent conditions. The first condition is that environmental integrity, of course, must be ensured, especially the question of the permanence of carbon sequestration. When we store carbon in trees, for example, if the forest burns, all the carbon is going back to the atmosphere. So we have to make sure so that the sequestration, the storage of the carbon that we have reabsorbed from the atmosphere is permanent. Even for underground storage solutions, it's not totally mature. We're not sure if it's really permanent. We're not sure about the potential in terms of volume of carbon that we can store and so on. So there are a lot of problems here. It's made so negative emission credits can help achieve carbon neutrality only if the company itself follows an emission pathway that is in line with a net zero target as global scale. Why? Because remember that the potential for negative emissions is limited. If you remember those emission pathways I showed from IPCC, we have to first reduce by 95% to be sure that we have enough negative emission potential to balance the 5 remaining percents that we are still emitting. So if a company reduces its emissions only by 20% and offsets the rest, the remaining 80% by with negative emission credits, so negative emissions, that means that it doesn't leave enough negative emissions for the others to do the same. It's not universalizable. Everybody cannot do that. So it's impossible to reach global carbon neutrality if everybody does that. So I'd say to claim carbon neutrality, a company should first align itself on the IPCC and Paris Agreement targets and reduce its emissions by 90%. And then maybe it could balance the rest, the 5 remaining percent, with negative emission credits. And also, we need a lot of transparency in carbon accounting and communication. Not just say, oh yeah, we have a carbon neutrality target, so we're doing what we need to do. Companies and institutions also need to communicate transparently on really how they will achieve their emission reductions, by how much, and which in which time frame. So I will now illustrate those 2 last points with 2 interesting initiatives that we find in the literature, and that are trying to give guidelines about how to set and to devise a science-based climate strategy. So on the fact that the emission reductions should be aligned with the Paris Agreement goals before claiming carbon neutrality, we have this graph here. So that's taken from the Science Based Target Initiative. So this is kind of a think tank that has been created by the Carbon Disclosure Project. And the Carbon Disclosure Project is a pretty big international association that is trying to motivate mostly companies, but also public institutions, to disclose their carbon footprints and their carbon strategies. So what we see here is that we have a target year, and at this target year, the remaining emissions are balanced by what they call neutralization. So that's pretty much, that's negative emissions, okay? So in their vocabulary, neutralization corresponds to negative emission credits, and compensation corresponds only to avoided emission credits. Okay, so that's mainstream offsetting. So what they say is that companies or institutions will be able to claim climate neutrality only once the target year here has been reached, so that their remaining emissions are balanced with negative emission credits. All the while, during all those years before the target year, the companies are transitioning towards neutrality, but they are not yet neutral. But they still say that you can still buy credits around the same amount that you are emitting. And that's why they call this strategy carbon positive or climate positive strategy, because you do more than aligning your pathway with the Paris Agreement targets and reaching, in the end, carbon neutrality. You do more than that. On top of that, by buying credit, you help others to achieve their own goals, because you finance, this amounts to financing emission reductions elsewhere. But that doesn't give you the right to claim carbon neutrality before reaching the target year. So that's the Science-Based Targets Initiative. Now about transparency and the disclosure of your goals and carbon emissions and all you do in your climate strategy. This other initiative is very interesting. It's called the Net Zero Initiative, and it's been developed by Carbone 4, which is a carbon counseling institution in France. So what they say basically is that there are three main things you do when you try to fight climate change as an institution. You have to reduce your own emissions, direct and indirect. You have to help others reduce their emissions, and that amounts to buying avoided emission carbon credits. And you have to implement negative emissions directly on site or in your operations, or through the purchase of negative emission carbon credits. But what's important here is that all those three kinds of climate action are separate, are different in kind, and should remain separate. You cannot transfer, they are not fungible in the vocabulary of economists. You cannot do transfers between the number of carbon credit you buy and subtract them from your emissions, as the mainstream conception of carbon neutrality does. It's impossible. You have to communicate, to fix targets, separate targets for all the three kind of actions, and communicate separately on all three. And they propose even a dashboard. So you have the three pillars, the three kind of action I just described. So pillar A is reducing my own emissions. Pillar B is helping others reduce their emissions. And pillar C, developing carbon sinks, that is negative emissions. So, and here it's in your operation, it's in the value chain or outside the value chain. That has been made for companies, especially in the private sector, but it can be adapted to institutions like universities. And that provides a clear framework to set targets and communicate on these three different pillars. But once again, they remain totally separated. Carbon credits are here. So for example, you can work on pillar B by buying avoided emission credits, or you can enhance your pillar C by buying negative emission credits. But once again, those don't give you the right to claim carbon neutrality, at least until you've reached your target year. So they go even further, this net zero initiative, than science-based initiative, because for them, carbon neutrality has meaning only at the global scale. So it doesn't make sense to claim global neutrality for a company or an institution, for example. So they will say that when you do this, when you put up a climate strategy, a company contributes to global neutrality, but it doesn't strive to be neutral by itself. So in terms of communication, there are several possibilities here, and there's no consensus yet on which one is the best. Some, like the Net Zero Initiative, say we should abandon the term carbon neutrality altogether, not altogether because it still has meaning on global scale, but at even national or at least subnational scale, we shouldn't use it. We shouldn't make carbon neutrality claims, but also only use alternatives, like saying we are contributing to global neutrality, or we're contributing to our national effort to fight climate change. Others, like the Science-Based Target Initiative, for example, says we should use the word transition. They say that we're transitioning to neutrality until we've reached our target year. And it's always possible to communicate on the fact that our climate strategy is aligned with the Paris Agreement goals. But anyway, I think, and once again, that it's very important to highlight the transparency and rigor of your climate strategy, and using this dashboard for that, I think, is a very good way to do it. So my take-home messages, just to sum up a little bit, is that first, the carbon offtake by natural ecosystem does not count in the definition of carbon neutrality at the global scale. And when I talk with local authorities that we help devise or define their climate strategy, we often hear that, oh yes, we just have to reduce our emissions until we've reached the absorption capacity of ecosystems. No, it's not true. We have to reduce enough so that we can actively implement negative emission technologies to balance our emissions. Second, carbon neutrality cannot be achieved through mainstream carbon offsetting, especially through the purchase of avoided emission credits. Three, carbon neutrality cannot be claimed until the target of a Paris-aligned pathway has been reached and balanced with negative emissions. We need much more transparency in carbon accounting and communication. So the NZI dashboard is good for that. And it's always possible to use other alternative catchwords to describe our efforts and to communicate upon our efforts to fight climate change, like contribution, transition towards neutrality, and so on. I say that because there's kind of a race towards carbon neutrality, especially among cities, actually, currently, and that's a good thing in one way because it raises ambition, but sometimes if you look at the details of the climate strategies behind those claims, it's pretty hollow and it doesn't match the higher standards of carbon neutrality that we would need. And that's why I usually say that if we don't define carbon neutrality with pretty clear and stringent criteria, it might be counterproductive, this race towards carbon neutrality, because it won't mean that a carbon strategy is especially ambitious if it uses the mainstream approach. So, well, that's it. I want you to leave room for Q&A. So maybe now, Delphine, I don't know if there are questions in the chat, but it's time to talk a little bit about that. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah, thank you, Augustin. So it is a quite a technical presentation, I should say. But my message would be that we are not facing, any citizens in case of universities. We are really facing scientists also among our researchers, and I think that's the element that you present is quite important in case we get some question from them about our carbon neutrality or carbon reduction plan. So that's why I think it's very interesting element. Thank you, Augustin. So yes, we have a few questions on the chat. So I will maybe take the first question, talking about the question about the protocols and the agreement you mentioned in your presentation. So we have Mr. Kazis, who asked if the Paris Agreement, do you know if the Paris Agreement talk about carbon neutrality by 2050, or is it or this agreement is just talking about the reduction of temperature? Because he said that from his point of view is more a EU target.
So actually, the Paris Agreement doesn't use carbon neutrality as a target. It uses indeed temperature goals, but from these temperature goals, and according to the IPCC, so if you want to limit the global warming to 1.5 degrees, the consequence of that is that we need to reach carbon neutrality by 2050, according to the IPCC. So even though the Paris Agreement doesn't use carbon neutrality, it's a direct consequence of the goals it enshrines.
Okay. And I think that it's a question, especially on your slides, Augustin, about the minus 6.2 CO2 sinking, which I think was in one of the first slides. And this same Mr. Kazis asked why this number is some variety in limits possible.
Okay, I'm going to try to share my screen again so that everybody sees. Yeah, okay. So it's this, I presume, the minus 6.2 here. So no, that's just an example taken from the Net Zero Target Initiative. Doesn't mean that it's exactly what we need to do. Probably we need to do better than that, according to IPCC, because this represents just, I think, reduction by 85%, but the IPCC goes even further, saying that we need to reduce by 95% to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. So that's just kind of arbitrary. It was just to show that if we emit 2.5 gigatons of CO2 a year, we will need to remove from the atmosphere the same amount.
Okay, yeah. So it's just an example. It's not something.
Yes, it's just an example.
Okay. And so we have also a series of questions about the scope 3. The first one will be, do the SBTI initiative talk about scope 3 emission and kind of recommend what kind of emission sector we should include in this scope 3?
I'm not quite sure about the science, the SBTI here. I think they, well, first of all, about the SBTI and the NZI, the Net Zero Initiative, those are work in progress. So they've already published reports and recommendations, but they are still refining their methods and their recommendations. I'm sorry, I'm not totally sure about the SBTI, but I can tell you that the Net Zero Target Initiative, the other one, recommends warmly to take scope 3 into account when you, at least when you calculate your carbon footprint, so that it gives you a sense of your full impact on the climate. Then when it comes to reductions, you should yes, also set an objective on for the reductions of scope 3, but this could be slightly different from your goal for scope 1 and 2, for example. So, but you have to disclose that. So maybe some companies would like to get totally rid of their scope 1 emissions by 2040, say, and divide by half, say, their scope 3 emissions. We have a good example for that. The city of Paris, for example, they have a climate neutrality strategy, and they hope typically, and I'm not sure about the target here, but it should be like 2040 or 2050, to reduce totally, to cancel totally their scope 1 and 2 emissions and reduce by 80% their scope 3 emissions.
Yeah, so you can maybe set some specific target according to which scope.
Exactly. Because we have to say also that scope 3 emissions, the responsibility for scope 3 emissions is a responsibility as consumers. And this responsibility is shared with the responsibility of the producer of these emissions. So that's why we have some leeway about scope 3.
Yeah, that would be also my response to those scope 3 as a sustainability manager, because we have a question about, do you have an idea of the average scope 3 contribution of a company? It's like, yeah, I mean, it's always, scope 3 is mainly, it's always, I would say, work in progress, because the company are still on the process, or the institution are still on the process of getting the data in order to quantify this scope 3. And it's also the fact that, as you mentioned, is not very clear to who is responsible for those emissions. In, for example, the question of food, how do we need to quantify the food impact? As a university, I would say, yeah, but the restaurant, I mean, the caterer, the institution or a company in charge of the catering should also take part, have the responsibility of at least a part of those emissions. So it's always a very, I would say, a domain that asks a little bit of negotiation. But you can also say, okay, I take maybe 50% of those impacts, and I let the 50 others for the company who is a producer of this service. So it's always something you need to explain. It's less.
But usually it's always good to quantify them as much as possible and disclose them. And then when it comes to setting targets, maybe there are some more leeway, as you said.
Yeah. So we have also a question about George Brown, who asked, in which area should organizations mainly reduce their emission, and how high should they set their targets, in your opinion? So I don't know if I may, Augustin, maybe suggest something.
Yes.
It's really depend on the context of your, in that case, university or institution, because you really need to have a carbon calculation at first to see how and in which sector you are in good position to make the most impactful measures to reduce your emission, I would say, because it really depends on the context. For example, I was during one of those UNICA green workshop, I was discussing with a sustainable manager from University of Iceland. And she was saying that in terms of energy, they were so clean, you know, with geothermy, and there was so much impact, very less impact in these sectors. But in terms of mobility, because of very rare public transportation system, all the people, even the students, were taking a lot of cars and doing a lot of kilometers to go to the university. And in that case, it was her nightmare sector, so to say. So yeah, it really depends on the system, and this decision should be linked to a carbon calculation.
Yes, so each case is different, and for each types of company, and depending on the sector in which the company is working, you will get very different results. When it comes to the ambition of the reductions, as I said, it should at least be aligned with the carbon trajectories that are defined by the IPCC. So more or less minus 50% by 2030 and minus 95 by 2050. Why that? It's what the world needs. I know it's very ambitious, and it could sound almost impossible to many people, but quite a lot of countries have committed to that now, or even subnational entities. And it's what the world needs if we want to avoid catastrophic climate change, simply. So, yeah.
And yeah, there is a lot of question of, I mean, what's maybe your opinion, Augustin, about the carbon, the credit system in general?
So I think there are loopholes and weaknesses in this grid system, partly because it's sometimes hard to be sure that those credits really correspond to avoided emissions. But I think if we stop deducing the amount of credits we've bought to our current and our own emissions, that solves part of the problem. Because then buying credits is useful because it finances climate protection projects or emission reduction projects elsewhere, and that's useful anyway. It becomes a problem only when there is a claim that what you buy under the form of credit can be subtracted to your emissions to reach neutrality. But once you stop doing that, and we should absolutely stop doing that, it's a first step to fixing this this not so ideal market. We also need more stringent standards about environmental integrity, especially regarding additionality. One very important criteria is that when, for example, you, if I take the example I've given during the presentation, that you replace a coal power plant with renewable energies, you have to prove that this is made possible by the financing that you get from selling the credits. If that would have been made anyway because there is government funding or there is a law that obliges you to do that, then the fact that you sell the credits doesn't bring much more than what would have happened anyway. So in that case, the credits are not additional and they don't correspond to one more ton of CO2 that has been avoided. Well, that's technical too, but we should regulate more this market and have stringent criteria.
So what do you say about Rebecca Lefebvre, who say that in her case, for the emission of business travel, the university buy credits in Uganda for avoided CO2 by building solar ovens, and she mentioned that is gold standard certified.
Yes.
And she asked if this is compensation or neutralization.
No, if it's avoided emissions, it would count as compensation in the vocabulary of the SBTi. So that's not negative emissions. That's avoided emissions. Okay. So the gold standard is a pretty good and stringent one. So those are probably good quality credits, but still, in my sense, they don't allow you to claim that the impact of those flights is cancelled. It's just that you still have an impact when you take a plane, when you fly, but on the other hand, you help reducing emissions elsewhere, but you shouldn't subtract and use this logic of communicating vessels between those two actions.
Okay, so there is lot of questions coming, and we are, reaching the end of the end of the presentation and the webinar. But maybe I hesitate between a very theoretical question and a very practical one. So maybe we can do both. So Hélène Kamula is asking if maybe you could give some good example of projects that produce negative emissions that we should push forward.
Well, that's a tricky question. I think that forestry and land use change projects have, when they are done properly in good conditions, have the potential, can be interesting, but there's still the problem of long-term storage. And there's also the problem of competition with other kind of production. So if you grow a forest, it takes a lot of land if you have to grow a lot of forest because you want to absorb a lot of carbon from the atmosphere. And this could be in competition with other uses like agriculture and food production. So I'd say, but we could also, another solution, a kind of natural solution, is to change agricultural practices so that agricultural land or farmland becomes a net sink rather than a net emitter of carbon. And I have hope that globally we can shift to such kind of agricultural practices to store much more carbon. Yeah, that's I think an interesting possibility. Another one is called BECCS, that is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So here you grow plants or trees, then you cut them, you burn them to produce energy, but then you capture the carbon at the end of the chimney, at the end of the pipe. And then you have to store it underground. So there are still technical challenges, but if we can manage to do that, it's energy positive. You sequester carbon, but also you produce energy at the same time. Clean energy, well, carbon neutral energy in this case. So that's interesting, but it could also enter in competition with biodiversity, for example, or food production. So we still have to be careful here. But I don't have an example of the perfect solution without any downside. Yeah.
Yeah, and there is a question that asks, should we go global negative to balance the Earth system?
Yes, that's a very good question. And if you, maybe I can quickly go back to my presentation. If you look at the IPCC scenarios here, we reach carbon neutrality by the end, the middle of the century, but then we go globally negative for the second part of the century. And that's to compensate the overshoot of temperature that has been produced by those emissions here in the first half of the century. So it's very likely that we will need to go even more than carbon neutral, but carbon negative in the second part of the century if we want to reach these temperature goals. It will all depend, I think, on what happens in the next 10 years. If we lag too much and wait too much before reducing steeply carbon emissions on the global scale, then we will for sure need to go negative in the second half of the century.
Okay. So I think that we reached the end. I'm sorry. I think that pretty much go through every kind of questions. I'm really sorry for the one that I forget. And I would like to thank you, Augustin, about this topic.
Thank you.
Which present, I should say, concept. And now we need to take that back home and reflect on how we can apply it on our university. But I should say that the highlights would be that we need to be very transparent about all that, and that we can do. It's not something not doable. And yeah, and pretty much because we are facing scientists too, and that's our role to be on the edge, at a very good level on that point as universities.
Yes.
So thank you very much. And I think that we close, I can close now the webinar. Thank you for all of you for the presence and the time of hearing us. And please, you can also inform you on the UNICA GRIM webpage about the next webinar to come. If you have any interest on those questions, there will be some other very interesting webinar to come on, and please see the program on our webpage.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for your attention and your great questions. And
yeah, have a nice
rest of your day.
yeah, exactly. And a nice weekend afterwards. Bye.